Hello, welcome to Chess Amateur Analysis. This is the game of Tigran Petrosian and Bobby Fischer. Petrosian, as I'm aware, was regarded as being a very strong defensive player who was renowned for crushing his opponents slowly. Fischer also says in his book, My 60 Memorable Games, that Petrosian was a player that liked to play a lot of cat and mouse moves. So I'd like to make you chase him basically, and then all of a sudden retaliate, I'm presuming. Um, this game apparently has a lot of mistakes involved. I'll try and point those out as I go along. If this has got a lot of mistakes in it, my games must have tons of mistakes in them, because both players do seem to be playing almost immaculately by my own standards. So it's interesting to see what the Grandmasters regard as a blunder. It's an interesting game as well because the ending of the game is with a scramble between both sides to get a pawn over to the queening squares. So they're trying to get their pawn to the edge of the board basically. Both sides trying to do this at once, and this is a common occurrence I've found in a lot of chess games that I've played, especially if you're very evenly matched with somebody else that you're playing. It can usually end up that you're down in material so much that you both just got maybe a rook or a bishop or whatever and a pawn as well as your king each, and it's a scramble to see who can get to the other side before the other player. Okay, let's get it underway then. So Fischer was playing as black, so Petrosian opens, pawn to c4, and Fischer plays the King's Indian defence, one that I use quite a lot. Reason being that I'm not really too sure of any other openings with black at the minute. I'm trying to improve. Petrosian brings the knight out. Fischer brings down this black pawn here, typical of the King's Indian opening. And Petrosian pushes his g-pawn, and the bishop is fianchetto. Now this setup here that you see in the top right hand corner of the screen, if you're not already familiar, that is known as the King's Indian defence. Fianchettoing the bishop, knight out, this pawn up, that's basically the start of the King's Indian. Okay, and Petrosian fianchettos his bishop, and Fischer castles within 4 moves. Very good. Knight comes up, and Fischer brings his d pawn down, and what that does is it releases this bishop down here. See how it's taking a long file, sorry, not file, diagonal. Also gives him the option to move the queen out to here to capture these two, should he move his bishop out first. And Petrosian castles. Fischer brings his other knight out. Petrosian completes his pawn chain, and Fischer's knight comes down to the side. Now notice that's on the rim. You may have heard saying a knight on the rim is dim, but Bobby Fischer put them there all the time. I heard a backyard professor say that a knight on the rim is only dim if it ends up staying there, which I think is the best way of looking at it. That, in my opinion, putting a knight on the rim can sometimes get you out of a lot of tricky situations. So if you're wondering about this and you've heard this saying and you think that you should follow it all the time, you don't have to. Don't do it. It's no good, especially not if the board warrants moving the knight to the rim. Just do it. Just do it, but keep an eye on it. Make sure that it doesn't stay there. Okay? And Petrosian pushes his pawn up. Pardon me. And Fischer's e-pawn comes down to grab the powerful e5 square. Petrosian pushes his pawn up, giving Fischer's knight a little bit of trouble, and the knight retreats, and Petrosian reinforces this pawn, and Fischer comes down to attack the reinforcing pawn. It's then taken, Fischer takes back, and knight comes up to take the pawn off the powerful e5 square. Look at that, it's a sacrifice, sacrifice that knight just because that square is so important. So Petrosian realises that, we should realise it as well. But Fischer very interestingly. A lot of people would have just taken that straight away, probably with that pawn or even with that bishop. But notice how Fischer, and this is really important, Fischer doesn't leap in and do that. He concentrates on developing his own game by bringing the knight down to the g3 square. Now, something that we should bear in mind. Fischer himself actually said that this knight was doomed anyway, presumably because it was on the rim. But he decides to sacrifice it for one of these two pawns down here. Obviously, the effect that that will have will be that the pawns surrounding the king and the king's defences are weakened, and the Petrosian takes the knight. Fischer retakes. It's a sacrifice and exchange. There we go. Had to get something back for it. Pawn comes up, pressing in the bishop. Bishop just moves back, and Petrosian brings his bishop out to the e3 square, and Fischer decides to develop his c bishop. Petrosian manoeuvring this bishop around a bit more, aiming at this bishop on the side here, and Fischer develops the knight further, bringing it down, and Petrosian brings his rook across and grabs the long open file there. And Fischer moves his rook, and bishop moves, and the queen comes across to close off that little hole that's been made in the king's defences, presumably. That's interesting. Look at that. There's a king move down there. You don't see people moving the kings very often this stage in the game, but there you go. These guys know what they're doing. That serves a couple of purposes. It's obviously protecting that. It's getting out of any danger that might appear on the h-file, and it's also reinforcing that as well. There's two powers protecting that rook. There's the queen, and there is the king. Providing the king doesn't put himself in check, he can take it. And Petrosian takes the exchange, which leads to the bishop coming up. Petrosian, waiting there in the wings, comes up, smashes his bishop out, ruining the king's defences slightly more. That Fischer retakes, and Petrosian suddenly comes up to put a check on the bishop there. Fischer, ignoring that, decides to develop his pawns on the left hand side, and the rook comes across to grab the h-file. Bit of pressure here coming in on the king side, Fischer's king side. Look, you've got not only the king, the bishop's here waiting, can come out to there if it feels like it, to try and grab that. And Fischer keeps developing his pawns. Moves his knight back, just Petrosian, and Fischer decides to move his queen across, possibly to put another power on that, protect that, so he doesn't have to move his king down to take it. And the knight comes up here. The intentions of the knight can be seen now. He's obviously aiming to get it over here to join in the attack, and Fischer mobilises his rook, and Petrosian starts developing his own pawns on this side, and the queens are exchanged, and the battle on the side here, the left flank continues. Fischer brings his rook to the top, bishop comes down, knight comes across, and the bishop's still moving, obviously trying to put pressure up on the king, and Petrosian keeps closing in. And Fischer now, he's realised he's got to get his pieces back here to defend this attack. And Petrosian does a couple of things with his rook now. He moves it down there, bishop comes down, and then he moves it a second time. Look. So obviously he's changed his mind about something now. Rook comes across, protecting that pawn. Quite a good idea. knight comes across, and Fischer starts bringing his king down. Possibly by this stage he's anticipated that there's going to be a bit of a battle in terms of getting a passed pawn. But then he decides to move it back again. So both people not really knowing what the other side's motives are at this stage, it seems. And the struggle on the pawn side continues, and knight comes back down. Such an interesting game, this. And Fischer draws first blood on the battle that was developing on this flank with the pawns. And Petrosian replies, and Fischer moves his king down. Rook comes across to the A file, and Fischer moves his knight down, putting the king in check. King sidesteps it, and check once again, sidesteps again. Knight retreats, and Petrosian developing his rook on this, moving his rook up to that file, and Fischer has to meet him somehow. And the pawn battle continues. And that's a check for Petrosian, which Fischer avoids, gets out of, moves his king across there, supporting the bishop, and the knight takes, and Fischer takes the knight. Petrosian brings the bishop up, attacking the knight, and Fischer comes across and attacks the bishop. Now this move here, this pawn move, was seen as a huge blunder by Petrosian. This reply of moving the king down there was Fischer's reply down here. This was also seen as a bit of a mistake, since the better move apparently would be for so bishop takes, king takes the bishop, and what we've got now is a scrap for the ending. It's a fight to see who can get a passed pawn first. Okay, exactly even now, king each and 2 pawns each. Fischer's by far the most threatening looking at this stage with this one down here, and Petrosian starts marching his pawns across. Fischer marches his, and check, and Fischer ducks his king in between those 2 advancing pawns, and Petrosian is marching his white pawns up also. King comes down to support that pawn, which is being threatened by the rook now. What Petrosian does in a second is a good example of how to react when you're in this kind of situation yourself. The way he uses his king to support these 2 pawns. So as that one moves up, Fischer threatens this pawn, but he moves his king up. He keeps supporting these 2 pawns, and Fischer also comes down here to threaten this rook. Obviously it can't take it because he can just take it straight away, and he does. Fischer takes, says he can't take it, he went and did it. And Petrosian moves his king up to this square here, the g5 square behind these 2 pawns, and Fischer continues moving his pawn down. Now it's not over just yet. Look at this, 2 pawns here against that 1 rook, and the pawn comes up to threaten the rook. And at this point I believe that Petrosian resigned. No, sorry, my apologies, it was actually a draw. I just read here, Fischer offered the draw, and apparently this was bad etiquette. I don't know why. Presumably maybe the white player has to offer a draw first, I don't know. Shows how much I know about chess, but I hope that was useful to some extent. As I say, don't expect scintillating analysis because you're not going to get it from me. Okay, thanks very much for watching.